Well, good evening and welcome to the Call Out. This is a show where we call out to people all over Newfoundland and Labrador to talk about the issues and events that are happening in this province, and we want you to join our conversation. Now, let's get started. On the program tonight, no surprise, big news of the day. The budget cuts to the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Service. Today, the Premier and Finance Minister announced that nearly 300 management-level positions are being eliminated. My guest tonight on this topic will be Stephen Tomlin, a political science professor at Memorial University, frequent commentator on provincial politics. We always appreciate his insight here at CBC, and Stephen Tomlin will be my guest this evening. All right, full speed ahead. Let us begin our conversation tonight about the provincial budget cuts that were announced today by the Premier and Finance Minister. I want to welcome to our program Professor Steve Tomlin. Professor Tomlin, let me just ask you, did you watch today's announcement by Premier Ball and Finance Minister Cathy Bennett?
Yeah, I did. I mean, obviously it was a pretty tough day for people that are going to be laid off, and they were trying to, I guess, explain some of the things that they're doing and why they're doing it. It was much more political, I think, than policy informed. I mean, again, obviously, this kind of idea that maybe we have too many bureaucrats, which, perhaps we do. Germany probably has more bureaucrats than people, than other jurisdictions, but whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think requires some kind of an analysis. It was also, I think, kind of interesting talking about the fact that they ran on a campaign where there was not going to be sector cuts and layoffs, but of course we had to have some kind of explanation of the extent to which the circumstances have changed. But I think going into the campaign, people were surprised that they ran on that platform.
Well, indeed, and they as they continue to repeat, they feel rather the Ball Liberals, it is their position that the former government, led by the PCs and former Premier Paul Davis, were less than forthcoming about the state of the province's finances during the 2015 campaign. They're saying that if they had the full picture, maybe they would not have made that province. I mean, do you think that explanation for what they're doing is registering?
No, I think people have kind of lost trust in government generally, and the executive branch controls information, and we are all kind of spectators watching it. I found it was interesting listening to Dale Kirby. I mean, I think his concerns in terms of understanding what are the core competencies, what are the needs, where is the analysis, and I think he kind of basically suggested that in terms of his department that they've been cut to the bone. There are all kinds of challenges or problems. So we can't just look at the aggregate. We can't just look at numbers and say, well, we have 300 that have to be cut. That this is kind of what is the case in other jurisdictions. But we really kind of have to understand and recognize that if we're going to make cuts, we need to do some kind of an analysis. And there really was not really any analysis. It was this kind of brand control. A lot of discussion about doing more with less. Really more rhetoric than it really was informed discussion. And I think that's what people are looking for. If you're going to trust government, they really have to make a case. There has to be kind of an understanding of what are the core assumptions. Where are you making cuts? What are the outcomes if you make these particular cuts? A couple of weeks ago, we had Pat Parfrey talking about the fact that we are overprescribing. Doctors are overprescribing. Much of this, of course, is coming from the patients, but the patients themselves are actually being hurt. So it's very costly, and the outcomes are not being met in terms of the way we deliver service. So we need that kind of an analysis. We can't just say, well, let's just cut positions, let's cut this number, without recognizing and understanding that there may be gaps. There may be more problems created by making decisions unless they're informed decisions. And I don't think we really have that kind of information. And I think we require it, and I think the public deserves it.
Okay, well, let's bring in our first question. This is coming from, again, the comments on our Facebook Live field, where Betty Clark Greeley says that these cuts may actually hurt the economy more than they help. I mean, is that a position, do you think, or, is that the reality? I mean, we are talking about a relatively small number of jobs in this time around. And we are going to segue to talking about the bigger picture of the public service. But we're talking about 300 job cuts. Certainly it's coming at a time when I think there's a lot of anxiety, fair to say, anxiety about the state of affairs in the province generally. So, Professor Tomlin, do you agree with Betty Clark Greeley that these cuts, these 300 management level positions being eliminated today, that this may actually have a depressing effect on the economy as a whole?
It could. We also often forget that we are a service-based economy. We're a knowledge-based economy. Very few people are directly employed in the fishery or even oil and gas. So we need to recognize and understand there are impacts. We need to understand and recognize that cutting one service may impact on other services. So unless we actually have some kind of analysis, understand not only the aggregate figures, but understand through qualitative kind of discussions and analysis to really understand what are the implications, what are these cuts, who will be hurt. And so again, we haven't really had that kind of conversation. I mean, the biggest employer in the province is the Eastern Health Authority. It's not the fisheries. It's not some of the sectors where we tend to basically leave alone. So I think we need to understand and recognize that obviously we are a service-based economy. There are benefits in terms of hiring people, if they're doing good work, if they're producing better outcomes, everybody benefits. If we're making cuts, just to make cuts in terms of cutting the budget, we need to understand and recognize the implications, whether anticipated or unanticipated. But it also kind of creates a mood, and people might not be buying things and might not be purchasing houses. So you need to recognize and understand, have that kind of conversation rather than just making cuts, talking about leaner and the assumption that everything is going to improve. The real kind of challenges or problems have to do with the executive branch. They have to do with things like Muskrat Falls. The problems themselves were created by the executive branch, but now I think there's kind of concern about having the executive branch dominating how these problems are resolved and who loses jobs and who doesn't. And I think that kind of conversation is required, and we haven't had enough of it. And in the cabinet parliamentary system, the executive has too much power, and they control basically the information, what information we have access to, or the lack of information that we have. And I think that is troubling.
Let me ask you, before I get to some more questions, and we appreciate that we have quite a lot of them coming in right now on Facebook. This is, I guess, the big picture story of the day is how does today's cuts, or do today's job cuts, presage a much larger rollback to the public service, either in terms of outright jobs or in wages or benefits in the spring budget. I mean, we have 48,000 people working in the public sector in this province. That is by far the largest per capita in the country. The finance minister was asked repeatedly this question today. Does this mean we can expect a similar rollback for frontline workers? She would not bite, wouldn't go there, says that those kinds of conversations about layoffs have not occurred in the budget, rather in the collective bargaining that is ongoing with public sector workers. But let me ask you, Professor Tomlin, if you can read the tea leaves. I mean, if you're a public sector worker sitting at home today, a frontline worker, how should you feel about the way that today's news may be in a harbinger of things to come?
Well, I think that's the challenge. We don't know what's happening. We don't have access to information. We don't know the basis of their analysis. So people are scared. I think people are concerned that we have a very small group of executive decision makers who are making decisions which are going to create challenges or problems for the people within their communities, within the education sector. It'll impact or influence everybody. So I think the biggest challenge is having these kinds of announcements where we are spectators, where nobody really knows what are the underlying assumptions, what are we trying to achieve, what are the objectives, what were the root causes which actually led us to where we are. And I think a lot of that has to do with the government itself. It has to do with the executive in the past in terms of some of the bad decisions that they have made. So I think the worst thing that we can have is people who are in fear because they don't have a sense that they have any control. And I think that there is a need for a common narrative, a common conversation, more kind of information in terms of what are the challenges, what are the problems, how are we going to resolve them. And for the most part, most of these decisions are political decisions, and they're not policy informed. And there's not an opportunity for people to engage, to share and express their views, to create some kind of shared perspective. And we haven't had that kind of conversation. And I think that's not good for the economy, it's not good for the community, and it's creating division.
Okay, well, let me bring in some people who are suggesting various alternatives to what they see as a rollback of the public service, or as that being the sole method, I guess, by which government goes about reducing going at the budget crisis.
Yeah.
Annabelle Clare, this is an often heard refrain. Why can't we put a price on junk food or all the unhealthy things instead, plus lower the prices on foods that actually make us healthy? I mean, what I guess she's suggesting, besides this direct approach of putting a tax on junk food, which we've heard a lot of people advocate for, is why can't we go at this problem in a different way that doesn't involve cutting jobs or rolling back on programs? Instead, can we come up with innovative solutions like taxing things that we can all agree we could do less of, such as junk food? I mean, would those kind of strategies be an adequate substitute for the strategy of making cuts to jobs or potentially cuts to services in the future?
A lot of this comes down to power and the power of kind of the private sector. Pat Parfrey, when he was talking about the fact that our doctors are prescribing and overprescribing and
Substitute
providing
for the
our
strategy of
patients access to services which they don't need and don't require, which is very expensive. We're spending almost 50% of our budget on health care. Rather than preventing these things, rather than doing things which within the public interest, we need that kind of analysis. People, if they're eating the wrong kind of food, which are producing, again, high costs in terms of health care, that's really the kinds of conversations that we need. This idea, again, that we should continue to not even talk about or think about areas where really we're not achieving our outcomes. The biomedical model is not working well. Our patients are getting more drugs than any other jurisdiction in the country, and we're paying more per capita in terms of delivering health care, yet we're actually hurting our patients because of the way the system is designed. So unless we actually start to begin to talk about the way decisions are made, where the resources are going and how they're being wasted, we do need to change our eating habits. We need to be creative. We need to reduce costs. And that's a much more, I think, effective approach in terms of decision making. But we don't have that kind of policy informed decision making or discussion. We're not allowed to have that, but I think we should. And there's a real appetite within the general population for that kind of conversation.
I got a question from a Jason Dyke who wants to know why don't Ball and Bennett themselves take a pay cut if they're expecting everybody to sort of share this pain?
Well, I mean that's more symbolic. That's more kind of brand control. It won't make much of a difference. I think the most significant thing that they can do is actually provide us with a very clear narrative, with a very clear analysis, outlining what their assumptions are, why they're making certain cuts. What are the outcomes or the likely unanticipated outcomes? Engage with the population, have populations, different communities come together to have a shared perspective. We know and recognize that there is a challenge, that there is a problem. Part of it's Muskrat Falls. I mean, part of it is bad decisions in the past, which is not being addressed. Part of the challenge has to do with a healthcare system and the biomedical model, which is not producing good outcomes, and it's very expensive. But we're not having the conversation because of the power of certain industries or certain sectors. But we need that larger conversation, and this is kind of, I think, sense that the people who are winners or losers are basically winners and losers in part because they lack power and they lack the ability to engage because the government will not allow them to engage. So again, a lot of these ideas need to be discussed, but we need to do so in a way which is more coherent. There needs to be less focus in terms of rhetoric. There needs to be a real conversation where we have an opportunity to contest, to actually to have our voices heard, and to have, again, some kind of a conversation which is more meaningful. But I think for the most part there's a lot of confusion in terms of what the government is doing, why they're doing the things they're doing. They ran on a kind of a false narrative, and now the public is frustrated or angry in part because they themselves did not create this mess. This mess, for the most part, was created by the executive branch of government.
Well, Stephen Tomlin, we really appreciate your insight onto this. It is the big talker today, and we appreciate all the people on Facebook who chimed in with questions for you. So, Stephen Tomlin, thank you again for your time this evening.
Great fun.